Okay, we are recording. Brilliant. So welcome everyone, good afternoon, and welcome to this Statutory Code webinar. So this is all about the annual complaints performance and service improvement report, and this webinar is for landlords with less than 1,000 properties. So I'm Anthea Chilton. I'm one of the sector learning and development leads here at the Housing Ombudsman Service, and I'm going to hand over to Verity in a minute, who will be leading the session this afternoon. But just to let you know, today's going to be recorded, and the session, along with the slides from today's presentation, that will all be available on our website through the Centre for Learning. So if you want to refer back to anything, the slides and the recording will be there. And also if you have any colleagues that couldn't come along today, they'll be able to watch it back. So that'll be there for them. If I could please, I think everyone is on mute, so that's really good. But if I could just ask you to please make sure you're on mute for the session, that would be really helpful. And before I hand over to Verity and we sort of begin, just to mention at the end of the session, I will pop a link in the chat to an evaluation form. I would really appreciate it if you could please fill it in for us, just to help us get your feedback and shape future sessions, so we can look to how we can improve and how we can shape Statutory Code webinars going forward. And it looks like everybody is here now. So thank you very much for joining us, and I will hand over to you, Verity.
Thanks very much, Anthea. My name's Verity Richards. I'm the Head of Duty to Monitor here at the Housing Ombudsman Service. My role at the moment is to share with you the Complaint Handling Code, and also to take forward our work to monitor compliance with the Complaint Handling Code as part of our duty as an Ombudsman Service. So I'll be running today's webinar. Anthea has given some housekeeping. So as she said, this session will be recorded. Please do keep your mic muted, just for background noise in any of those sessions. When we've been through our presentation, we have a short presentation for you. We'll be answering some of our pre-submitted and frequently asked questions, and we'll be using those to answer the questions. You'll see here highlighted that as the Ombudsman Service, we are currently under specific protocols because we're in the pre-election period. I just wanted to make sure that you are aware of that. So you're very, very welcome to add questions or comments in the chat. And normally we would look to answer those questions during the webinar to try and make that as useful for you as possible. Under the current arrangements, what we're going to do is we'll be taking away those questions. As many as possible, we will answer as soon as possible. If there is anything that we can't answer due to our current arrangements, we will make sure that we have a record of the question that was asked, and we will provide that to you. Just wanted to be upfront so that everybody was aware of that. Anthea has already mentioned we really do want you to fill in those evaluation forms. It's really important that we run these sessions to meet the needs of the people that are joining us. It's not about us getting a pat on the back, it's about us making sure that we are learning, we're providing that support to the landlords and other members who want to understand about the code and be compliant. So as Anthea said, and the session today is all really focusing on the annual complaint handling and service improvement report. This is a new requirement which is set out in the Statutory Code, and we have really included this as an opportunity for landlords to really demonstrate that openness, that transparency to residents, to demonstrate their accountability. But beyond that, it's just not about a tick box activity. It's about sharing your key achievements and challenges. And we know that small organisations particularly have a really open dialogue with all of the residents. I'm sure that you are speaking to them very, very regularly. I know that many organisations are running regular newsletters, town hall events, and this really seeks to bring together the complaints information into one place so that that can be reviewed, scrutinised, and landlords can really demonstrate that compliance. There are requirements which we'll go through in a little bit more detail so that you know exactly what needs to be included. Those requirements were published in the Complaint Handling Code under Section 8 earlier on this year when the code was published in February, but we have received some queries about it, and we wanted to give a bit more information and some food for thought for those people that are still in the process of finalising their reports. So as you can see here, it is a statutory requirement for all members of the scheme, regardless of size, regardless of organisation. And it does need to have some very specific excuse me, information included. In addition to the information about the landlord's own complaints, which you will be seeing yourselves and that we will never, but very likely we would not see them as the Ombudsman, it does also require all landlords to include any reports or findings made by the Ombudsman. Now, as small organisations, you may not have any, and we wouldn't, that's fine, absolutely fine. So your reports will almost certainly look very different from one another and different from larger organisations, but all organisations will be required to include those. For all organisations with a website, we are requiring that that is published on the website alongside a statement from the governing body. And again, we'll go into that in a bit more detail. This report will be used by the Ombudsman to monitor compliance with the Complaint Handling Code. So it does include the self-assessment, which will look at the compliance of the policy and procedures that are in place for handling complaints. But that report will give more context to the way that the code is being applied in practice. So in terms of the requirements that are set out in the Complaint Handling Code, what must be included in the annual publication is firstly the annual self-assessment. And I've already mentioned the governing body's response to that self-assessment. So for anyone who didn't attend or hasn't had the opportunity to review our webinar about the self-assessment, there is a link in here that you can go in and review that. So filling in the self-assessment and more information about the governing body's response, which I will touch on, just highlighting that that webinar is there for you. An analysis of complaints performance, so that would be key information about the volumes of complaints, the types of complaints which have been brought to the organisation, but also any which have not been accepted or issues which have not been accepted into the complaints process. We're very aware that there will be times that it's not appropriate for the complaints process to be used and to be followed for particular issues. We've set that out in the exclusions of the Complaint Handling Code. So it's just important to be transparent about which ones, which issues or types of issues haven't been accepted. One thing that I would just really highlight, and you will know this far more than I do and than we really ever think about, is just as small organisations, particularly if you have a very small number of properties, just being really mindful about the amount of detail that you're putting in about individual complaints. Obviously with being small organisations, there is an opportunity that somebody may recognise themselves or a neighbour. I know that you know this, but it's something that was just important to highlight in particular. Beyond the individual complaints and the numbers and how they've been responded to and details about any themes and trends that you're seeing, it's a really important opportunity to share those service improvements which have been made as a result of complaints. And we know that from our work that some of these service improvements will relate to the customer's journey, and quite often it does, and we see quite a lot of those changes being made in response to complaints. But don't forget any of the changes which you've made as a result of service improvements, perhaps changes to systems, just to really demonstrate that to your residents and also to be able to reflect on it as an organisation. This should be a good opportunity to celebrate those changes which we know are being made all the time in response to those complaints. You'll see below there are 3 areas which I have specifically highlighted. These are, as we've said, the code applies to all organisations, and some of the landlords in this room won't have any of these to be reported by the Ombudsman. We recognise that we don't see complaints necessarily from smaller organisations. Some we do, some we don't. So you may or may not have any of these. So any findings of non-compliance made by the Ombudsman, so that would be any formal findings related to compliance with the code. The Housing Ombudsman's annual report on the landlord's performance and the complaints, and then also any other relevant reports by the Ombudsman, and those mostly relate to our special learning reports which focus on an individual landlord. So I did mention in terms of the publication that I would just touch on the self-assessment. So you will need to publish a completed self-assessment. The purpose of that is to set out whether the organisation complies with each provision of the code and provide evidence that it does. So that could be looking at different evidences, such as referring to the policy, referring to external reports, whichever evidence the landlord's relied on. And then if a provision isn't complied with, explaining the reasons why a provision hasn't been complied with and what alternative approach is in place. If the organisation isn't currently compliant but intends to become compliant, we would expect them to set out that timescale, and we'll be looking at those on an individual basis to make decisions and to track those through to completion as necessary. In terms of the governing body's response, that does need to be from the board or equivalent. Some organisations refer to their their governing body by different names, but it's the board or equivalent. They have overall accountability for the landlord, how it's run, and the final decision making. We don't have any formal requirements for what's included in that statement. That would be for you to work with your board to know what it is that they want to say. And if we've had some questions about where we would expect to see that statement. Quite a few organisations have said that they want to include it as the welcome to their publication, and that is fine as long as it's clear where that is, and it can be referred to by residents and also the Ombudsman. This is where you can find the link to our previous webinar where you can hear about that in a lot more detail. The next area that I highlighted was the analysis of complaints. So I've said already, volumes of complaints received during the year, any themes or trends, and then I've said here the types of complaints that were not accepted and any reasons as to why they wouldn't be accepted. That's not to sort of highlight any barriers, but really to help manage residents' expectations where there are alternative processes which are more appropriate. There are some other areas that you might want to consider. This all depends on your own organisation, your relationships and the work that you do and how you run your landlord services. Some organisations have been looking at root cause analysis, so looking at those themes and trends, understanding is there a common root that really could be fixed, and actually that would resolve a lot of other complaints. That's something that you may want to consider. For those of you who may be members of benchmarking organisations or have relationships with other organisations, sharing benchmarking is a really valuable way to demonstrate how you are performing in comparison to other organisations. Could be of similar size, could be of the same location. More widely, we've heard some really good ideas and had some really great questions about other things that could be included in the analysis of complaints. Resident scrutiny work, absolutely. We would really encourage landlords to share any scrutiny work that residents have done to assure the complaints process, to maybe look at the figures that have been included. Have you done any peer assessment work? So have you worked with another organisation? Or if you've had any independent reviews completed by an independent third party. That does tend to be from the larger landlords that take that approach, but we're just highlighting it as something that you may want to consider. The reason I mention it is it's really important to highlight that during our consultation, we did get a lot of feedback from residents around the self-assessment and the report, feeling very much like landlords marking their own homework. It was something that really came across strongly in the resident feedback, and we're really keen to encourage landlords to make the most of their relationships, to build that trust with their residents, to really demonstrate that that is open, it is transparent. So that's just some food for thought for you as you're working through these. In terms of the Ombudsman report, so those are those three different sections. So the information that the Ombudsman might publish about a particular landlord. For clarity, so any findings of non-compliance, what we're meaning here is any complaint handling failure orders issued in that 12-month period. Any reports issued under the duty to monitor. We haven't started there. We will be starting our work now, so that is an immediate write-off. Please you don't need to include anything. It won't be there. We haven't started doing that work yet. We are asking landlords to include any findings of maladministration in complaint handling, and many landlords are saying that actually they're going to report that full information. The annual report from the Ombudsman, so relating to the landlord report, we publish those every year. They are published in the autumn time, which we are looking at changing, and we are working hard to change it. We recognise more recent information would be much better. But we only publish them where there are more than 5 determinations during a particular year. Now, some very small organisations are just not going to have them. We don't produce landlord reports for all organisations. That you can check and you can see if they are there. If you don't have a landlord's report, it would be expected that you would explain that and confirm that in the report, just so that you can demonstrate that it's not a case of you hiding anything. There isn't a report, and you can refer people to the Housing Ombudsman's website if they want to get clarity or look at an independent view. Similarly, any other relevant reports that won't apply to all landlords, but we publish them all on the website. What we're really talking about here are our special learning reports. You might have seen them. They are sometimes colloquially known as paragraph 49 investigations. That's because we're using our powers under paragraph 49 of the scheme. And they really focus on individual landlords. They're published on our website, including learning statements, etc. And for those organisations that have had one of those published, we would expect to see that that was also included. Could be a link, but we would expect them to be using that to share with residents and make them aware. And on a similar vein, any severe maladministration reports published about the landlord. So if there are any, we would expect those to be referred to in the report. And just highlight here, we do have some frequently asked questions about this, so you can also refer to those. These are live links, so you'll be able to see them. The other area which I highlighted was around service improvements. You will know what service improvements you've made as a result of complaints. Some of the improvements that organisations will see will feel very small, or might feel quite small, like changing a template or updating a web link. They're all worthy of considering to be included. It does demonstrate how you're listening to residents, and if you want to add more context and maybe refer to other information or feedback or engagement activities you've done, you are very, very welcome to do so. And I really encourage you to. I just thought I'd share here some of the examples that we have seen from other organisations, some food for thought about the approaches which have been taken. These are all taken from our published learning reports, and you might see that there are learning statements now being included in a lot of our publications, and we're encouraging landlords to really include that as part of their reports. It helps them reflect on learning, and it helps build that relationship again with residents. And I think we'd all agree in the room here that prevention is better than cure. So sharing what prevention work is being done as a result of complaints, that would be what we would be looking to see. Some other areas to think about when you are looking at your annual publication. Firstly, making sure that all the key elements are included. If there are any elements which can't be included for any particular reason, being open and just saying this information can't be provided because we don't have a report from the Housing Ombudsman, or we haven't collected that information, but next year we intend to do it by doing this. If you are including data which we would expect to see. So we've mentioned volumes, themes and trends, being really sure that it is accurate and reliable. It's repeatable, that you have that audit trail that you can look at to make sure that they are correct. Again, it was something that really came across not only from residents in our feed in our consultation on the complaint handling code, but also through our wider reports, so our knowledge and information management spotlight report, that residents do really feel that there have been times that data hasn't been accurate, and sometimes that can really build that sense of mistrust and skepticism. And it's just making people aware that just be sure of any of the figures that you are reporting. I've mentioned already the opportunities to benchmark. So comparing like with like, or comparing local with local, they're things which you can consider, but also thinking about beyond the numbers, is there any qualitative information that you could be looking at and sharing? So for example, are there any particular types of complaints which are affecting you in a similar way to other organisations, and drawing that out in the report. I've said several times about service improvements, so have you set that out very clearly? And then also thinking about, are there successes or challenges which you think residents should be aware of, and that you think that should be shared with them? You will know your residents, you will know what's of interest to them and what's really important to them, and you know your organisations. It's just food for thought and how you might want to include that information. And again, how can you include residents' voice in the report? That could be through case studies, it could be through directly involving them in developing the report. There's so many opportunities to really think about that. So again, we're encouraging all organisations to really think about how they can do that. So once you've got your publication, and that information is all drawn together and being aware and publishing that, it's just highlighting some areas to consider about that publication. So firstly, accessibility. So thinking about if there are alternative formats which are needed. Are there particular groups of residents that you're aware of that may need another language or large print? Just knowing those residents, knowing what they are likely to need, and being aware of that. I've highlighted here about timescales for any alternative formats. You know, I'm guilty in a past life of relying on big word, I'll be honest, and that took far longer than it should have done. So just highlighting that, and that's a personal experience there, so just being aware of that. When any of the reports are being published, I've also highlighted here about beware of links. It's not to say that links aren't appropriate, but you don't want them breaking and suddenly disappearing and that information being lost. So if you are using those, just be aware of those links. The other thing to think about is not burying any of these reports. Now, I hope sure nobody in the room would want to do that. I think the fact that you're all here says that you're looking for that openness and transparency. We have unfortunately seen instances where reports and information are buried in a whole hole of different clicks that you need to get through on the website. Make sure it's accessible. You're going to create great reports, don't hide them. In terms of awareness, residents, absolutely, just highlighting what about your hard to reach groups. There are many organisations which rely entirely on websites, just highlighting about the alternatives. Again, you know your residents, you will know what those alternatives can and should look like, but just really highlighting that for consideration. Beyond residents, this is a really important opportunity to involve and update staff, your own teams. I'm sure many of them will have been involved in either handling the complaints or making changes as a result of them. They will, I'm sure, be very invested in it, and we would want to see that to be shared with them. I'm sure you'll have lots of other opportunities to share information about the report, publications, newsletters, meetings. You will know where best to do those. It's food for thought, it's things to consider. We've heard some really interesting ideas, and if anyone has any, and we'll be looking for them during the year, then please do share. We're here to amplify good practice and to share that information across the sector. We've had organisations talking about doing town hall events and scheme meetings where they can go through the report, ask any questions of key members of staff, discuss findings, etc. That's a huge benefit of being a small or having a very local offering. Podcast discussions with residents, particularly residents who've been involved in scrutiny, and sort of sharing that alternative approach to scrutinising the report prior to publication. And then resident editors to support the development of the report. There is a landlord who was saying that they are planning to do their report entirely by video, which will be very interesting to see how they comply and the work that they do. But there are some innovations which are happening, and we're really keen to see what works so that we can learn from different organisations and share that across the wider sector. We do have a free online learning module, which is available. The link's here. You can sign up and do it on the Centre for Learning. It's a short course. It's CPD accredited for staff, and it does highlight all of these key elements about the code, but also the self-assessment and the annual report, which will need to be published. So that is another resource which is available to you. Beyond that, we do have a significant amount of guidance and support which is available. So we have a whole website page set up for the complaint handling code. We have specific guidance which is set out for completing the self-assessment, for providing that submission, and also more information about what the Ombudsman expects to see and how we're going to achieve and deliver our duty to monitor compliance. And that is all on our key topic area. For anyone in the room that is part of the governing body or maybe a member responsible for complaints, we do have a specific page which is there, which is available. There is guidance for governing bodies, so good scrutiny questions, how to challenge and assure that any reports are accurate and up to date. That's available there. We've mentioned spotlight reports, so we do have our knowledge and information management report, and we also have a number of smaller breakdowns about the recommendations. They are there on the website. Attitudes, rights and respect is also there, so those are there for you to refer to. We do have our complaint handling failure order reports. They're reported quarterly, and they highlight all of the different complaint handling failure orders that we've issued landlords. But beyond that, it also includes information about how we've intervened to support landlords to comply with the code, because in our experience, most landlords want to comply. They want to comply, and it is a really beneficial part of the learning for us to work with them to support them to achieve that compliance. I've mentioned already the landlord the landlord performance reports. They are all on the website now for 2022-2023, and as I've said, we will be anticipating publishing 2023-2024 in autumn. We're looking at how we can bring that forward so that the information is more timely. Lastly, if there is any other questions that you might have following on from the webinar, or looking at our frequently asked questions, we do have a team, and many of them are in the room with me today, which is the Duty to Monitor team. You can see our email address here. You can contact us with any queries or concerns that you might have, and we'll offer guidance to you. We aim to respond to any of those queries within 5 working days. If there is something that is a bit more technical, and particularly during this period, because we are in the pre-election period, we may take a little longer, but we will respond to you to confirm when we'll provide that information, and we'll be mindful of that if there are any future queries that we have about compliance with the code. That's nice standard for us, so keeping in touch. There are many ways that you can keep in touch with us. We do have I still find it very hard to call it X, but Twitter. I'm going to stick with Twitter. I'm sorry for anyone that is going to be calling it Expert Twitter. We are on LinkedIn. We have our newsletter and also our website. So you can find out about the latest information that we have and any of our future webinars there. I think I've managed just about to stick to time. People in my team will be timing me. So those are the slides which cover the annual publication. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand over to members of my team who have got some of the pre-submitted questions and frequently asked questions to share with you. If you have any others, I can see that the chat has already been used. Please do put them in the chat, and as I've said, we will respond to you as soon as we're able to, and ideally look to provide those as soon as possible, so we know time is ticking.
Thanks, Verity. Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Claire, and I'm going to be going through the pre-submitted questions this afternoon. My colleague Kirsty is going to be answering those for us. So if we move on to the first question we've received, is there going to be a template or more detailed guidance on what is expected from the annual report following initial submissions? The code is very limited on what exactly is required in the document, so it might lead to great variety in what landlords put in their reports.
So in terms of the report, we're not prescriptive on the format, and so there's not going to be a template for landlords to complete. The only requirement is that it has to contain the information that we've set out today. So in terms of clarifying that, you can refer to the slides, which will be shared with you all after this session. And the code also sets this out in section 8. It will be up to individual landlords to ensure that all of those points are covered in the report. But as I say, the structure and style will be down to each landlord to decide on. Obviously, over the course of the next year, we'll be receiving submissions from all of our landlords. So where we identify some good practice, we'll be sharing those at the end of the year, which landlords may want to then, consider for their own format for the following year.
Thank you. The next question, in terms of publishing on our website, we will be sharing our self-assessment in full. However, do we need to publish a copy of the whole annual report, or can it be extracts?
So obviously this just applies where the landlord does have a website. Bear in mind, the report is designed to be an externally published document rather than an internal review. So yes, in short, you will need to publish a copy of the whole annual report. Landlords can, consider how it's raising awareness and taking steps to improve accessibility to the report for residents. You're best placed to understand the needs of your residents and how you can use those insights to offer the report in a variety of formats, languages, ways in which they can be accessed. As Verity mentioned, one landlord's doing it all by video. And landlords may want to consider an easy read version of the report, which pulls out key information.
The next question feeds into that as well. So are we okay to create the report in a web page format to better support the use of accessibility tools, or is a document required? We would clearly label it as a report.
So again, just following on, we're not prescriptive about the format or the layout, just that a full copy is published on the website. So if this is, a good tool to meet your residents' accessibility needs, then go for it. Equally, if you have residents who don't use website or internet, having another version available for them, we would ask. And then in our submission form, we'll be asking for a link to relevant documents, and we can accept a web page link for the report.
That's great. The next question, what if due to deadlines with getting our report to the governing body, we establish from these sessions something that hasn't been included in the report this year as it's already been written? What are the consequences for organisations in this position?
So the code does set out clearly what we're expecting to be included in the report. So if there are any elements where the landlord hasn't collected or recorded relevant information or data for publication, this needs to be set out in the self-assessment with an explanation for the reason, and then the intended action the landlord will take to achieve compliance, which is obviously the same with any of the other code provisions, and also set out in the annual publication report for transparency for residents. We'll be looking at submissions on a case-by-case basis, taking a view on whether any of those explanations are reasonable, and the timescales landlords set out for resolving any non-compliance. And, we'll be taking a view on that from there. But we will kind of just, note at this point, if we do identify any missing information that's not been highlighted and the landlord hasn't explained how it will comply going forward, we will be contacting the landlord to notify them of our findings, and they'll be required to take action, such as updating the report and resubmitting this information to the Ombudsman.
The code states, excuse me, the annual complaints, performance and service improvement report should include any annual report about the landlord's performance from the Ombudsman. The is for 2022-23. Should we include this, as we'll be reporting on 23 to 24 performance, and it might be confusing?
So Verity kind of explained that in the presentation, which is to say, at the moment, the most recent performance report for people for landlords, who've had more than 5 determinations is 22-23. So that will be, need to be made clear in the report. It's not exactly the same reporting data. We are going to try and review that going forward to see if we can get those reporting periods to tally.
Okay, next question. The annual self-assessment along with the report is due to be considered by the board in July, which is outside of the deadline for the 30th of June. Therefore, we won't be able to submit the governing body's response. Is there anything you can suggest we do?
So we understand that for local authorities, members' meetings are usually booked on an annual cycle. So some allowances may need to be made on a case-by-case basis this year, and that particularly applies now with the general election being announced and the date of that. So for this year, what we would say is you need to ensure that self-assessment and report is completed and submitted to us by the end of June deadline, and then explain in that submission the governing body response will follow and by what date we can expect to receive that. And then after that meeting, the board can review the self-assessment and report. So there is that internal scrutiny, and it can then provide the response following that, which the landlord then needs to make a further submission to us using that same form. If the board wants any changes to be made to the complaint policy or self-assessment following the review, this needs to be set out in response, and then the revised policy and self-assessment again submitted to us with that governing body response.
Our organisation delivers housing and non-housing related services. We've adopted the Housing Ombudsman's Complaint Handling Code as best practice across all of our services. However, when we submit the annual report, are we just looking at our housing services or all of our services?
So first of all, we're really pleased to hear that you're using the Complaint Handling Code as best practice across all your services, because it does represent excellence in complaint handling. In terms of the reporting for us, we are looking at data from tenants, licensees and leaseholders. So that is basically just housing services. If the landlord accepts complaints from those in a non-landlord tenant relationship or a member of the public about other services, then it's up to the landlord whether or not they want to include that information in the report, but that should be really clearly set out in the figures and kind of distilled out.
So moving on to the final question. The report needs to include a summary of the types of complaint landlords have not accepted. What if this information is not recorded, or is that only applicable from April this year?
So landlords are expected to include the 23-24 performance against the code in place at that time, covering the points listed in paragraph 8.1 of the code, which did include the types of complaint the landlord has refused to accept. If the landlord didn't collect that information during that reporting period, the landlord will need to explain that and the changes it's made for this reporting year so that it's incorporated into the data captured going forward and will be able to be reported on next year.
That's great, thank you. That's the end of the pre-submitted questions. So over to you, Verity.
Thank you. I can see that there were a couple of questions which had come in through the chat. Those people that were asking about dates for submissions, I've put in a link for our code compliance framework. It's set out there. We also set out what we're expecting in terms of monitoring that compliance. So please do take a look at that that particular document. What we will do is, normally, as I said, we would pick out some of the questions and then provide those responses, but at the moment we're not in a position to do so. I'm sure that we'll be able to answer these and get back to you, but that's the approach that we're taking with the timing of this particular webinar. We are getting responses to any of these types of queries out within 2 to 3 days of the webinars. We are turning these around as quickly as we possibly can because we know it's really important. So you can expect to see those from us in the next couple of days, and we'll link in with Anthea to make sure that that is shared with everyone. If you do have any further questions that you do want us to consider, again, normally we would offer for you to share them and then we would be able to answer them, but we can't do that at the moment. Please do put them in the chat here, and we will continue to monitor it after this meeting closes or would formally end, which would be 2:30. So if you want to put any of those questions in there, we'll pick those up and we'll be able to provide those responses to you. So I'm going to wrap up at this point and ask Anthea to share the evaluation form. Just highlighting, we know that a lot of people are considering the timings and looking at the submissions process. We do have 2 further webinars which are going to show landlords how the submissions form works, where you can get that access, and just make sure that everybody's comfortable and confident providing that return to us. We're intending for it to be as unburdensome as possible. We're trying to make it as straightforward as possible for you to provide that to us. So links to relevant documents, no need to copy and paste full information, but we will be running a webinar that we will showcase that particular approach. For anyone that is using the portal or has asked questions about whether we're using the portal, we're not intending to use our online portal. We are using a bespoke system to do this. So that will be made available. We will still be sharing information through our newsletter. So if you're not signed up to our newsletter, I'd encourage you to do so. We will be sharing more information there and contacting landlords directly just during the period that we're in at the moment. Anthea has shared the feedback form. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I hope that's been useful. Please do give your honest feedback and we'll take that forward. And any questions, as I've said, pop it in the chat and we will get back to you. So thank you very much, everybody.